Three things immediately spring to mind when we think of ancient Egypt: pyramids, pharaohs, and mummies. For millennia, the Egyptian civilization and its mummies have enthralled mankind. But why and how did they mummify people? We will answer this and other questions in detail in today's video. Death in Egyptian civilization was not seen as the end of existence, but as a transition to a new way of life. This deep-seated belief in the afterlife influenced many aspects of Egyptian culture, particularly the practices related to preparing for death. Death was as crucial a stage of existence for the Egyptians as life itself. They believed that how they prepared for death determined their afterlife experience. Preparing for death was a detailed and careful process that began long before a person passed away. The Egyptians not only concentrated on living a righteous life to secure a favorable place in the afterlife, but also spent time and resources preparing their burials. This included acquiring funerary items, ordering sarcophagi, and building tombs. The funerary items were carefully chosen, as they would be used in the afterlife. They ranged from personal objects to treasured items such as jewelry and amulets. The tombs, which were often more elaborate than the houses themselves, were seen as the eternal dwelling place and were built with great care and detail. One's morality and actions during life were considered of the utmost importance, as it was believed that these would be judged in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead, a guide to the afterlife, provided formulas and instructions that the Egyptians followed to make sure they had a safe transition and a good afterlife. The belief in life after death and mummification rituals has its foundation in the myth of the god Osiris. He was the first mummy, and his myth gave the mythological and religious foundation for all the other mummies to come. However, when the death of the person was announced, the body was taken to the so-called ibet, or embalming house. This was a sacred place where mummification rituals were performed, one of the most fascinating and iconic aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization, reflecting the belief in the afterlife and the need to preserve the body for eternity. The Egyptians thought that it was essential for them to preserve the physical body if they wanted to achieve life after death. They viewed the body as the dwelling place of the soul and the life force, which regularly returned to it. Preserving the body was crucial for the continued existence of the soul after death. The process of mummification was intricate and elaborate, having developed over millennia. The first mummification methods used natural dehydration in the desert, and there is evidence that they date back to before 3500 BC. With time, the Egyptians improved their embalming techniques for even better preservation. We will now dissect this process of mummification in detail. The first real stage in mummification was to cleanse the body with water from the River Nile. This was considered sacred and purifying water. Next, the internal organs were removed. The brain was pulled out through the nostrils with special hooks. The abdominal organs, stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver, were taken out through an incision on the left side of the body. The heart, considered to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was usually left in the body. After the removal of the organs, the body was covered and filled with a natural salt called natron, intended to dehydrate and preserve the body. This process lasted around 40 days. Once the organs were removed, they were treated separately, dehydrated with natron and wrapped. They were put in canopic jars to be buried with the dead person. Once dehydrated, the body was cleaned and wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen strips. While it was being bandaged, ointments and resins were applied to help preserve it. Amulets and objects of religious significance were frequently placed between the bandages. Following the bandaging, final rites were performed to ready the deceased for the afterlife. The practitioners behind the mummification were highly specialized, many of whom were also priests and carried out rites during the process. A death mask, often an idyllic representation of the deceased, was then placed over the deceased's face. The mummified body was then transported to one or more sarcophagi, lavishly decorated with texts and images. Eventually, the sarcophagus was laid in the sealed tomb. One of the last steps before the deceased's final resting place was the opening of the mouth ceremony. an essential funerary ritual performed to reinstate the sensory and functional capabilities of the deceased in the afterlife. This ceremony was key to making sure that the deceased could breathe, eat, see, and move in the afterlife. A series of rituals and incantations were performed during this ceremony by a priest, often a son of the deceased. He would use special instruments to touch the mummy's or statue's mouth, symbolizing the restoration of the ability to speak and eat. Offerings of food and goods were placed in the tomb for use in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptian tombs were intricate constructions filled with meaning, designed to be the eternal dwelling place of the dead, especially the pharaohs and nobles. They were sophisticated constructions with elaborate artwork and were built long before the person's death. Nobles were granted grand funerals full of honors and rituals, usually only 70 days after their death, as this was the time necessary for the entire mummification process to take place. Once the body was finally buried, would the spirit have access to the afterlife? Tombs were often built on the west bank of the Nile, facing the living cities, as the west was associated with the underworld. On the inside, many tombs had chambers and corridors adorned with hieroglyphics and scenes from the life of the deceased and religious texts. The tomb walls often displayed paintings and bas-reliefs depicting the deceased taking part in a range of activities, as well as scenes portraying life in the afterlife. These also included texts and magical formulas to help with the journey after death. The Egyptians thought that the dead would need material objects in the afterlife. This included furniture, jewelry, food, clothing, and household items. These objects were often of immense value to the pharaohs and nobles. Tiny figures, called ushabtis, were inserted into the tombs. It was believed that they would act as servants in the afterlife, performing physical tasks for the deceased. Amulets, statuettes of gods, and magical texts were added to protect the deceased from dangers in the netherworld. Some dead were interred with versions of the Book of the Dead, a set of spells that guided and protected the soul in the afterlife. As soon as the body and possessions were inside, the tomb was sealed. The final burial rites were carried out to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. The Egyptians thought that the human being was comprised of several parts: the body, the ka, which can be translated as life force, the ba, the personality, the name, the shadow, and the ak, the immortal form. Death was viewed as a temporary transition in which these distinct parts separated. Mummification was vital, as it was believed that the ka returned to the body after death, meaning that preserving the body was essential for the ka's survival. Following death, it was believed that the ba and ka would reunite to form the ak. To do so, the deceased had to set off on a hazardous journey to the afterlife, facing challenges and monsters. A key element of the afterlife belief was the trial before Osiris, the god of the underworld. First, however, the heart of the deceased was to be weighed against the feather of Ma'at's truth. If their heart was light, they could continue their existence in the afterlife. If it was heavy, they would be devoured by the demon Ammit. If they were tried successfully, the dead arrived at the field of reeds, a peaceful and abundant haven, like Egypt, but without suffering or sickness. The living took an active role in worshiping the dead, making offerings and prayers to support the spirits of their loved ones. Unlike what many think, the Egyptians did not believe in reincarnation and the return of the spirit to the mummified body. Egyptian culture focused on preserving the body through mummification to help the soul continue to live in the afterlife. This continued afterlife was more a form of spiritual immortality than reincarnation, in the sense of being born again into a new body on earth. The concept of reincarnation as a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth in different physical forms was not part of Egyptian religious cosmology. Mummification in ancient Egypt was not just a simple funerary practice, but a crucial element of the Egyptian belief in an afterlife, reflecting a profound devotion to the soul's immortality. The Egyptians expressed their quest for eternity through mummification, ensuring that the dead were honored, protected, and made ready for eternal existence. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and comment on what other topics about ancient Egypt you would like to see here on the channel. See you in the next video!